Are reconvened back in public session, and as any of the public watching will notice, we are live and in person with all of us for the first time. That has once again changed a little bit how we do public comment. We value public comment. We are looking for the best ways to make sure that you can have a chance to have your comments in our meetings, but please recognize during this COVID environment, things change. The public has been great, and the community of Darien has been great about the fluidity of that with us. At the moment, we are still on the public comment email, which I have checked. I don't have any comments at this point. I will check again at the end of the meeting to see if we have received anything. But please know we value your comments. We are trying to do this, have our meetings, get business done, and honor the safety and well-being of everyone involved.
Tara, I'm sorry, do you have to start? Do we have to start?
Nope.
No,
that's different.
Okay.
But thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
So we will begin today with Patrice McCarthy, who has traveled down from CABE to help us as we go through some board professional learning, which we do every year. First, we'll start with the presentation of roles and responsibilities of Board of Education members, and then the board's self-evaluation. You all received the tool a couple months ago. We'll probably do a quick vote to adopt that as the tool, as I haven't seen any tools from anyone else, and then we'll run through that process. But first, Patrice is here to help us kind of continue to be good board members, and so I will hand it over to you, Patrice.
Thank you so much, and it's truly a delight to be here. This is the first opportunity I've had to work in person with the Board of Education since March 16th, so I commend you for that, and I really look to you as exhibiting one of the best practices in terms of boards can come together in person, just as we'll be opening schools for our students and staff, and you can do it safely and responsibly, and you still have ways to include your public in your meetings. So it really is a great pleasure.
Patrice, can I just say that I've known Patrice forever, and her expertise and her general counsel and what she does up there has been just all over the state is really well respected. So a special welcome from me to you for coming down. Thank you again, traveling down in person. It's very much appreciated.
Absolutely. I have to tell you, I am zoomed out. I don't know if anyone else is feeling that way. So it's really good to see people. And see their expressions, because when you're far enough apart, we can actually see smiles or expressions of concern. So I'm going to begin with talking about roles and responsibilities. Normally, if I had more time, I'd go around and ask you to respond to a question. I'm going to encourage you, since I see you have a lunch break, to do that activity during lunch, because the question is, why did you agree to serve on the Board of Education? And I think that will help you, if you don't know each other really well, it will, or if you've been on the board for quite a while and maybe even you yourself have forgotten why you signed up for this. I think it'll help create that sort of common ground that's so important, because when I've done this activity with other boards, the similarity in responses is really rather remarkable, and people learn something about each other. And I'm pretty sure your answer won't be, gee, I signed up because I always wanted to develop a policy about wearing masks in school, and now I get my chance. So let's talk a little bit about your authority as a board. And for some of you, this will be a review, but again, it's good to have your professional development so you're all on the same page with the same information. You have very specific statutory responsibilities. There's a constitutional right to public education in Connecticut, and the legislature has delegated responsibility for delivering public education to local and regional boards of education. So while you are a town body, you answer to the legislature in terms of duties that you have to fulfill. The legislation specifically talks about meeting state mandates, and goes into some very specific things about the care and maintenance of the buildings, providing transportation. This is an issue that has come up again because of the issues around safely transporting students as we return to school. Unlike many other states, transportation is part of the right to a free public education in Connecticut. So that's a whole responsibility that school boards in some other states don't have. So this role means that while you are funded locally, you have many of these state requirements that you have to fulfill. And certainly in the area of policies, there are a multitude of policies that the state legislature requires that you adopt. The good news is, in many cases, you might say, well, why do we have to have a policy about homework? Well, because once upon a time, there was a legislator who introduced legislation that would have said, you can't have more than 30 minutes of homework in elementary school per night, and not more than 45 minutes in middle school, and an hour in high school. And we said, well, do you really need to prescribe this in state law? Well, we've got to do something about homework. Clearly, the legislator's child was complaining about the amount of homework. That's how some laws come to be. So what we said was, all right, if this is so important that you want boards to address it, then require that they develop their local policy about homework. And then that gives you the discretion to say anything from teachers shall decide how much homework, or something that has some more parameters around it in terms of maximum amount of time. So when you look at those list of policies, graduation requirements, discipline, attendance, promotion, reporting of bus complaints, there's a history behind each one of those. And for the board, that policy role is a very important part of your responsibility, because it's how you set the overall parameters, and then through administrative regulations, it's up to the administration to carry out those policies. So right now, when you think about, well, when we had a large snowstorm a few years ago, there was in a very small town, there were board members that said, I'm going to go up on the roof and get that snow off the roof, because the roof might collapse if we don't remove the snow. Now, that's not a Board of Ed member role. Obviously, that's an administrative role to make sure that they either hire outside contractors to deal with it, or the custodial crew can deal with it. In the current environment, an example would be, it's not the job of Board of Ed members to go into classrooms and take measurements to figure out what the desk configuration would be that would provide the maximum physical distancing among students. That's a job for the administration to manage, and then report back to the board as to what they have found and what their plans will be, which I see you're going to be talking about later this afternoon. So you wouldn't develop a policy about how you're going to configure the desks, or you wouldn't develop a policy about who's going to shovel the snow off the roof. That's where that board policy-making role and the administrative operational role is so important to think about. One of the very broad requirements in state statute for boards of education is that you prepare a statement of educational goals, and that you review that and update it every 5 years. So that's obviously the best practice of every board, but it's also a statutory requirement. And so that gives a big picture as to, where is a district going? What are your long-term objectives? Obviously, we've had to be flexible and adjust, and in many cases re-examine what some of those objectives are. So the goals that you set, whatever the last time you set them were, obviously you need to now look at those in this new context that we've been challenged by. One of the things that happens when, particularly for newly elected board members, is that the community's perception of you changes dramatically. they now view you as the Board of Education. So when they have a conversation with you about their concern about what the classrooms are going to look like when their students come back, about where the bus stops are, many members of the public think that you can take care of that because you're on the Board of Education. So the important thing to remember is that you only have authority when you come together in a legally constituted meeting. As individuals, despite the public perception, you actually don't have any more authority than you did before you were elected to the board. So that's an opportunity for you to help educate members of the community. We talk about communications and chain of command. So when a parent comes to you with a concern about a classroom teacher, your job is not to say, oh, well, I'll go sit in Mrs. Smith's class because my son or daughter had Mrs. Smith, and you're right, she really has terrible classroom management skills, and I'll take a look at that. That's not what you're going to do. You say to the parent, well, have you talked to the classroom teacher about your concern? Yes, they have. No change. Well, have you talked to the principal? Have you talked to the superintendent? Help guide them through that process, because you know what those processes are, and that way you can truly help them to be effective and to advocate for their child and to have their concern addressed. And obviously at the end of that communication chain is, they can bring a concern to the Board of Education. Obviously, if it's about an individual child, it's preferable if they can deal with that at some other point in the process to protect the child's privacy. You also, and feel free to stop me at any point that you have questions, because you really don't want a monologue.
Oh.
I'll pause.
It works as a discussion, so I'm all for it. Just raise your hand and we'll go from there.
Yeah,
I mean,
really.
We just went through it.
Exactly. You had your personal.
Patrice has been down with John and I on John's orientation, but I know Dave didn't have her, and Patrice is an attorney and a policymaker and up advocating in Hartford, so she's a great resource. So if you have a question as we go.
I was curious how social media comes into play. We talk about collective authority of the board, and then an individual goes out on social media and posts something about the Board of Education.
Okay, can you hold that? Because I'm going to talk a little bit about social media, okay? It comes under freedom of information and in my agenda, but it's an issue. But I make sure I talk about that. All right, so one common question is, well, what's our role as board members in evaluation? Well,
wait, actually, can I stop you for a second, just to go back to your last point? Because I do think that's an important point. I think a lot of us get approached by people and they say, I have an issue, I want an answer, and I elected you, so your job is to be responsive to me. And that's understanding. Generally, that is kind of what we expect of our elected officials. And tell me if I'm wrong, but I think we've probably all experienced that. I elected you, so you're responsible to me. And yes, my understanding is we are held accountable by votes, right?
Right.
But when someone comes to you in the grocery store and says, Duke Denise, you need to fix this and do this now because I elected you, do you have suggestions on how you explain that? Without a long history of boards of education.
You know what I'll do? I will sit. We actually printed up, and I don't have them with me, little laminated cards that give responses to, not that you're going to carry it around and pull it out, but it's you can refresh your memory from time to time.
I would love to see those responses.
Yeah, I would too.
They're all socially appropriate responses. What you respond is by trying to help the person understand how a Board of Education operates. Now, that may be more information. They want their problem fixed. They really don't care how the board operates. But you say to them, we're a collective body. We can only take actions when we come together. But let me help you. Let me walk you through what you can do with this concern that you have. And I'm going to take the example of it's a specific concern about their child or their child's school. And so that's when you go through have you talked to the classroom teacher? Have you talked to the principal? Have you talked to the superintendent? Well, if it hasn't been resolved, if you do all those things and you still don't feel it's been resolved, you can offer to them, get back to me then. And if you hear the same concern, for example, from 5 different people in the community, you might want to call Dr. Adley and say, just want to give you a heads up, this is what I'm hearing. I don't know all the facts, I'm not doing any personal investigation, but just a heads up. And Dr. Adley may say, oh yes, I know all about that, and here's how we're resolving it, or, thanks, I will probably look into that and see whether there's a basis.
So I also think sometimes it comes up, I do think this board is pretty good once we make a decision that we all kind of stand by the vote and the decision. I think we do that well. I do think sometimes, at least the question has arisen before a decision is made, right? When we're kind of all contemplating and someone asks that feeling of, okay, I'm a board member, we haven't made a decision. I certainly have a right to free speech and my own opinions.
Yep.
Right, but how or what, I know a little bit of this is like personal gravitas on things, but how do you recommend board members on kind of, let's say, a controversial issue respond to either press inquiries or people if the board has yet to make a decision?
Right. Best practice is that board members don't give their personal opinions to the press, that they wait until there's a board decision, because again, you're just one individual on the board, and that the chairperson or the superintendent serve as the spokesperson for the board. How you certainly gathering listening to public input if you're about to make a significant decision is very important. You'll be doing that in the grocery store, whether you want to or not, and you'll be doing that during formal public comment. One response is, or one way to think about it is, until you gather all the information, you may not have come to your personal opinion about an issue. And so it's important to convey that you're going to listen to the input, you're going to listen to the recommendation of the administration, you're going to listen to the views of your fellow board members, because we've certainly seen situations where people arrive at a meeting believing they're going to vote one way, and after they listen to the views of their peers on the board, they say, well, gee, I hadn't thought about that part of the issue, or this implication, and they end up in a different place than they were when they came into that board meeting room.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I stopped you.
No, it's much more interesting if we have a conversation. So the role in evaluation, there's one employee in the district that you evaluate. That's the superintendent. And I think you did that this morning. So the other important thing that we'll talk about in a little more detail later is you evaluate yourself as a board, and that's also very important. In terms of your role as an adjudicating body, if you have a teacher termination, that comes to the board for final action. With respect to student discipline, the board is only involved in the case of an expulsion. You don't have a role in suspensions. That's dealt with by the principal at the building level. Now, I always have to share a piece of good news because attorneys aren't known for generally sharing good news. So another frequently asked question when people get elected to the board is, well, should I transfer my assets into the name of my spouse or significant other because, can I get sued? And the answer is, sure, you can get sued. You can get sued if you take an action. You can get sued for failure to take an action. We can't prevent someone from filing a lawsuit. But the important thing is that by statute, you are indemnified. So you are protected as long as your actions are not wanton, reckless, or malicious. And none of you look wanton, reckless, or malicious, so I think you're good. And that they're taken, that the actions pertain to your responsibility as a board member. So that's the good news, that, yes, there have been lawsuits around special ed issues, children injured on the playground. The Board of Education gets named in that lawsuit, but you don't have to hire your own attorney. You don't have to worry about your assets. The only place in Connecticut law where you could be held personally liable is if you knowingly overexpended the budget. So you get your reports from your director of finance, you see that everything is fine, not an issue. August comes and the auditor comes in and says, well, actually there was this special ed placement that you got the bill for on June 30th, and it's $250,000, and that puts you over in the red. You didn't knowingly overexpend. You didn't have the bill. It hadn't been sent to the district yet. You're completely protected. The other scenario is you're getting financial reports. You see that because of extraordinary expenses related to COVID, related to unexpected special education costs, you start seeing in March the projections are that you won't have enough money to finish the year. You go to your municipal officials, you give them the information, you ask for an additional appropriation. Should that not get resolved, you can't overexpend because then you would be personally on the hook. You see what's happening. We've never had a case in Connecticut where that didn't ultimately get resolved. Sometimes the Commissioner of Education has had to step in a few situations and bring municipal officials and board officials together and figure out how they're going to deal with it. But it's important that you just know that there's that one area that you could be liable.
How does that work with COVID?
Well, we've never had a pandemic before.
Yeah,
so
I was gonna say.
We know that, I think it's tomorrow, districts are reporting to the commissioner their estimates of costs related to reopening schools because of COVID. And yes, there is some federal money that has come to Connecticut. Obviously, nowhere is near enough to deal with the increased costs. The governor has said publicly that he is committed to being a partner with communities around addressing those costs. Exactly what that's going to look like, we don't know. We're part of a coalition of statewide organizations that include the Superintendent's Association, the teachers' unions, and the Principals Association. And we will definitely be advocating, and we will urge all boards to advocate for the resources that they're going to need that you couldn't have anticipated. You certainly knew when you were finalizing your budget that you would probably have some increased costs around reopening, but even now we can't be sure what those are going to look like.
Okay, Mr. Brown.
Like process and communication would be key there, and then as opposed to as long as you are talking and communicating and paying attention to the financials. It
right.
Seems like there's an intent implied for you to be liable. Sorry for jumping.
No, I just was going to ask, when you mentioned the reckless standard, what that looks like in this context?
I would say reckless would be you get a report that one of your playgrounds at your schools is unsafe, and your administration recommends that you close the playground until it can be made safe, and the board says, no, it's important that kids have physical activity, we're keeping it open.
So intentional disregard of a known
exactly.
substantial risk. Okay. And then to Jill's point with the knowingly standard, I'm guessing this is constructive or actual, and in terms of how that'll play into the COVID, because we don't, constructively we knew it would be something, but actually we don't know.
No, it would be actual, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and in terms of reopening around COVID, if you're following the state guidance, then that's the best, and you're following the guidance of your local health director. That's what you are not health. Maybe some of you are, but you are not collectively health professionals. You're not going to make those judgments. You're going to follow that guidance. And that doesn't mean that you can guarantee absolute safety. You couldn't guarantee absolute safety before COVID started. Things happen.
Mr. Burke.
Circling back to the scenario where a board could be liable for overspending, this would be specific, mean personally liable?
Under the statute, yes, but let me assure you, it has never happened. So that's only there so that that flag goes up, so that if you get a financial report that says we're going to have a problem with the budget, you pay great attention to that, and you focus on how are we going to resolve that, and you're going to reach out to the municipal officials and say, we need help because we need to run school for 177 days this year, and we're not going to have enough money to do that. So again, that communication starts the process.
Thank you.
Speaking of funding, so when you adopt your budget, when you present your budget and then you get an approved budget from the town, the one thing you can't do is overexpend the bottom line, but you can certainly transfer funds among accounts as you get reports that indicate maybe you don't need quite as much in one area and you're going to need more in another. The process of getting to an adopted budget, it's important to remember that you are the town body that is responsible for education. So you are the advocates for the students in Darien. There is no other town body that has that responsibility, not the Board of Selectmen, not the Board of Finance. It is the role of the Board of Education. And so that means that when your budget is adopted and throughout the year, it's important to have communication with other groups in the community, the Chamber of Commerce, the senior citizens, when they could gather at the Senior Citizen Center, so that they understand what the needs of the district are and why it's important to have support for the budget. Questions about that?
Yeah.
I think that's a fabulous point. As a practical matter, how do you see districts doing that? We don't convene meetings before these other various constituencies to discuss our budget. We have our budget meetings, and those are comprehensive discussions, but what's that scenario look like?
It varies by community. Sometimes the superintendent goes to a Chamber of Commerce meeting or a Rotary meeting, using what your connections are in the community. You're probably members of various civic or social groups. Especially if you have a big upcoming need. The time to work to get community support for a school construction project is not going to be the month before the referenda. It's going to be a couple of years leading up to that to show why a school needs to be completely renovated or why a new building needs to be supported. So it's those connections, and that's something that at some point it's helpful for a board to talk about. Who are you connected with in the community? And how can you use that connection to help build an understanding of what the needs are?
So is that more of an educating role in the sense of going out to, I'll use the Rotary Club, let us educate you on what we do, and I don't mean that in a lofty way, but let me explain what we do type rather than sit down very directly, what do you want? Let me bring your wants forward. Let me educate you on what we do, why it's important. Let me understand your perspective on things. But because I do think sometimes that gets, in an effort to want to cooperate, some people, it's possible, can confuse let me pull up a 10th chair to a 9-member board. And you're well, that's not really what I'm saying, but I want you to understand how we work and what we do.
Right.
So it doesn't seem foreign to you.
Exactly. It's the educational role.
Okay. Mrs. Ritchie.
So just
expanding on that, as we go out into the community, it wouldn't be the 9 of us individually going out to these various groups. You would send the superintendent or the chair to communicate with the community, whether it's we're building a school, and it always seems to be education. Everybody's like, we got to cut education, we got to cut the budget. So I think that is helpful for people to understand what all of this entails, providing education for children. But I think what I'm getting at is it shouldn't be all 9 of us going out to the community individually.
Right. I mean, certainly you can be a positive ambassador for the schools in the various groups that you're involved with. But it should be an organized outreach.
Mr. C?
I was just going to use the word outreach, and then to Ms. Ritchie's point, it will be the board's decision how it would like to enhance that outreach. It's not one set rule. We'll decide as a board how to do that and direct that. And you make some good points. We do some great outreach among certain interest groups in town, but probably not others, that we should probably broaden our horizon and figure out as a board how we can do that in a better manner.
Well, I think we've touched a little on that in the sense of like, we've tried to have a CDSE rep, we've tried to join Health and Human Services, we've tried like the community fund we've sent the superintendent to. So I think it's probably always a great discussion to figure out how to do that better and best, right? And how to change some of those. But I think almost some ways, I don't know about you all, but I feel like we take for granted all of the organizations that we do it with, because at this point we kind of do it rotely. Excuse me, this is a child calling. Oh. But continue on real quick.
Okay. There's a formal and informal component to what you're saying too, right? But by definition, we are somewhat ambassadors, and in our natural daily work, we would conduct ourselves as Board of Ed members. And then there's a formal piece, which is I think more to what you're speaking to, Deb, or where a superintendent or a board chair or a specifically defined liaison would go out and represent the board for the purposes of education or something similar.
Exactly.
Thank you.
All right, I'm going to talk a little bit about freedom of information. Just some of the things to remember. You're a public body. When you convene in public, you're subject to all of the freedom of information requirements about posting of meetings, about public access. Obviously, those were altered somewhat by executive orders during the pandemic. But it's not just meetings of the board that are subject to freedom of information. It's all subcommittees and any committee that the board sets up. Even if you set up a committee that didn't have any board members on it, if it's a committee created by the board, it's subject to FOI. Let's talk a little bit about social media and communications. First, in the FOI context, communications among a quorum of the board could constitute an illegal meeting if it's not done, if it's not posted as a meeting. And obviously, boards have gotten much more effective at doing things virtually. That can have the downside of you get so used to doing things virtually that you forget that sending an email or setting up a go-to-meeting among a quorum of the board still has to meet all of those FOI requirements. So it used to be, back when, those phones that had like rotary dials on them? Well, I've been doing this long enough so that, yes, there were those things, and sometimes a board chair would call a quorum of the members of the board, one after the other, because you can only talk to one person at a time, and ask them how they were going to vote on an upcoming issue on the board agenda. And the Freedom of Information Commission ruled, well, that's an illegal meeting because you have had a discussion, even though it's been one at a time, with a quorum of the board, and that discussion should have taken place in public. Well, now the same thing can happen through email, through Facebook, through Twitter, through things that I don't even know what they are. Because if you post something and it can be completely innocently, you post something and you don't expect everyone to even read it, of your colleagues on the board. But a quorum of then engage in a discussion about an item of board business, that can be an illegal meeting. So you have to be careful, on all the issues around people not realizing that they're not muted and saying things that if they were clearly gathered around a table in a public forum, they never would have said, but the caution, it's exhausting to be on alert all the time, but we do have to be on alert all the time because the inadvertent, not malicious, but just, whoops, we've now had a conversation, and that should have been at the board table.
I feel as if this board has had a fair amount of FOIA experience, exposure, education, but I think the overarching goal, right, because sometimes FOIA ends up feeling burdensome in the age of technology. But the overarching goal is that we do our work in public.
That's right.
So the public can follow along.
Yep.
Right? So I think sometimes that gets lost. And maybe because we have had to be so diligent, right? We've had people, and I think all of us really mean to do it correctly. But it's like our goal is to do our work in public so the public can follow along, so there's no issues of transparency. And we just have to be careful now that technology is making this even easier to inadvertently have meetings.
That's right.
Okay. Mr. Cini.
There is an exception to that with the emails, and that's organizing meetings,
Yep.
scheduling meetings. So maybe talk
Yep.
about some of the exceptions.
Sure.
Because,
Sure.
In many cases, we try to communicate to get things on the agenda and that sort of thing. So help us understand where the line. I know it's gray, but maybe help with that.
So there are things that under the law, believe it or not, are not meetings for purposes of for purposes of the Freedom of Information Act. They look like a meeting, they might act like a meeting, but they're just not governed by those requirements. One of them is communications around setting up meetings, setting up the agenda, setting up the doodle poll about who's available next Thursday, what times would work for you. Those are not subject to FOI. Those can be group communications. Similarly, whatever your process is for putting items on the agenda, that can be done electronically without, or by phone, without triggering the Freedom of Information Act. The other things that are simply not meetings, chance or social meetings. So two of you meet at the grocery store 6 feet apart, and or four of you happen to be at the grocery store 6 feet apart, and you have a conversation. But keep the conversation about how your kids are doing and whether you're back in the office and social, right. I was going to say what you did for your summer vacation, but that's going to be a really short conversation this year, isn't it?
We spent a lot of time together.
Yeah, right. Caucus of single members of a political members of a single political party. That's outside of FOI. For boards of education, most boards only caucus around the selection of a chair, and we strongly encourage that as a best practice, because when boards start caucusing about multiple agenda items, you really end up having a hard time coming together, since your common goal, regardless of party affiliation, is about the education of the students. Collective bargaining is outside of FOI, so meetings of the negotiations committee, updates to the board on the progress of collective bargaining, not governed by FOI. Those are really, and executive level personnel search committee. So when the board engaged in a superintendent search, you probably appointed yourselves as the personnel search committee. Those meetings were all not governed by FOI.
So can I just go back to an email for an agenda item request? So that goes out to the entire board, but then the scenario is a discussion ensues among the board and email starts going back and forth. At some point, does that slip into FOIA? Okay, I just want to see
Yeah. If you're just talking about should this item be on the agenda, will the administration have the information ready for the next meeting, or do we need to defer it to the following meeting? That's okay. But if you start talking about the merits of the issue, then you violated FOI.
Okay.
So our process has always really been that, like, you send that into the chair with the vice chair copied if you'd like, and the superintendent, rather than the whole board, to try to avoid that because it's murky. I mean, I've read the rulings on it. It's
right, because
as an individual, I might feel differently than the way the commission decided. Like, what are the merits of the issue?
Right.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
if
that
that's
area
your
can be a little
process.
Stay away from the merits.
Absolutely stay away from the merits, but if your process is send your request for an agenda item to the chair, the vice chair, and the superintendent, then that avoids the whole, now it's gone to the whole board or a quorum.
I guess if someone then chimes in and says, oh yeah, I agree with that request as well, then it's becoming a discussion, and then we could be slipping into a FOIA bowl.
It's the slippery slope problem. And again, it's inadvertent. You know.
So how do you get agenda items on?
Tara, you want to talk about your process?
We have a policy that dictates it.
Right, but if we send it into the chair and don't hear anything, we may hear thank you, but don't hear it's going on the agenda or doesn't go on in short order. What is best practice around agenda planning for boards in your?
One thing you can do is, if it's like long-term things, when you have your annual retreat and you talk about what are the priorities for the year and what are the things we as a board think we need to learn more about, and then set up a schedule for those things to occur on future agendas.
And then what about
so I
things
think we had a question. There was an agenda item sent in early on. The administration was not prepared to do it. And I would agree, I'll just say as the chair, I probably could have communicated better that, like, this agenda item, the administration is not ready to report in yet. But I think the feeling of the board members who sent it in, and Jill, and I think it was yours, so I don't mean to put words in your mouth, was like, I've asked multiple times and this hasn't come up. So I think we did learn from that, of like a better feedback loop.
Yeah.
But it's gone beyond that, and we can talk about this when we go through our evaluation, but it's gone beyond that issue. Having a subcommittee address something, or, and we haven't put things on the agenda. So I don't know if this is the right time or.
Well, why don't we hear what best practice is?
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to figure out.
There's a mechanism, so you can make a motion.
Yeah, there's a mechanism within policy.
Sure.
We have policy, that is our expert, but go ahead.
Any board member can make a motion to add something to an agenda. Now, best practice is give the administration and the board chair a heads up, because adding something to the agenda that the administration doesn't have the right staff at the meeting to help respond to, hasn't put together the report that would be needed for the board to have a meaningful discussion, that's just going to not be productive for anyone. And certainly now more than ever, boards need to help the administration balance the sort of daily deluge of immediate concerns that have to be addressed with things that, maybe 6 months ago you had more luxury for the central office to focus on certain things, developing certain reports, because they weren't dealing with how are we going to put up the screening around each entry desk in our buildings. So, does that help?
Mrs. McCammon.
I have a question when it's appropriate, back on the social media.
Sure.
It's sort of two parts. So there are times when, as board members, we may have individual experience that differentiates us from our fellow board members. So I'll use a specific example. I have a child with a medical complexity, and it could be that the board got together and said, we really want the vaccine, we want to get rid of the medical exemption.
Yeah.
I might, as an individual, the religious exemption.
Yeah.
I might, as an individual, disagree for my own set of reasons and might want to differ from the board. I would vote know in that case, and I might, if the paper asks me, want to say something, and I might also want to post on social media to my cohort to get them up and moving. Sometimes we find ourselves in a position where I want to uphold the will of the board, but in this case I would be unable to. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, those are some of the more challenging things that board members face. I would say you clearly have your own, the board makes a determination, and that will be, you as a board won't ever decide whether the religious exemption is honored or not. You're going to advocate. And so you as an individual certainly retain your right for your own reasons to advocate differently. What I would say is you can differentiate between even though you will be perceived as a board member, in your advocacy, don't attack those that have taken a different perspective, including your board colleagues. If a majority of them have said, we as the Darien board are going to send letters to our legislators and communicate, that's fine. In your letter to your legislators or your emails, don't disparage the decision that your fellow colleagues made. Make your case based on your personal experience.
That's come up for us before, and it's been a little bit of, I think with the best of intentions, sometimes a sticky wicket for us. Do we do that then as, I'm just going to use your example because you put Jill McCammon. Mm-hmm. Do we do that as Jill McCammon, Darien Board of Education member? Like I do think sometimes we want to be as effective as we can. It gets a little murky, right? And I don't. So how would you do that if the board has made a decision to do something and you want to advocate? I would agree with you. We all feel passionate about issues that have informed our life experience. Do we just leave it at Tara Achman or Tara Achman Board of Ed?
I would say that the best practice is you then advocate as an individual because you're not doing it in your Board of Ed role. The board has taken, or maybe the board took no action on an issue that you feel passionately about, and you want to advocate, then you're doing that personally. You're doing that as an individual.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. The one thing I will say about parliamentary procedure is use it. It's designed to keep things running smoothly. Use it as a tool, not a weapon. There are 6-hour workshops on parliamentary procedure, and we're not doing that today. Okay?
It's a thick book.
It is. It's a very thick book, yeah. And it doesn't really, a lot of the things in Robert's Rules don't really apply to gatherings of 9 members. It's just it's meant for different environments in many cases. Want to talk a little bit about board evaluation, self-evaluation?
Yes.
All right. In your...
Mr. Marley.
Sure.
So you mentioned that we're all advocates for students. And one of the questions that we hear a lot is if we disagree amongst each other, we're politicizing things. And we all come from different parties. And how do we respond to the part where if we disagree with someone's opinion, we're being political?
Try to disagree with the issue, not with the person. So don't make it personal. Boards don't always agree on everything. That you can have a healthy discussion as long as the discussion is respectful and doesn't attack the individual for their viewpoints. Then, if it's perceived, if you've done those things and it's still perceived as, it's just political, I'm not sure you can change some people's perceptions. But how you engage in the debate makes a difference.
But I guess the question would be, is there there have been people in the community who have said you shouldn't be able to tell if someone's a Republican or a Democrat when you're sitting at the board table. Is that a fair statement, or can you have views that are sitting on one side or the other?
Our experience is that the most effective boards are those where the board members themselves say, I don't even think about the party affiliation of my colleague. Once we finish electing the chair, we move on, and we are all working for the best interests of the students in our community, and that's not a partisan issue. It's not that members of one party care more about kids than members of another party. So that's really my best answer.
Mrs. Stein.
Oh, no, sorry, I was waiting to make
it.
Thank you. Sorry.
So we want to move on to board evaluation, self-evaluation?
Sure. All right, you have the second two handouts that I gave you both pertain to, they talk a little in more detail about roles and responsibilities of the board and the superintendent. And I think we've really, they give lots of examples of, the board is policy development, the superintendent and his staff is implementation. In the document called Success Strategies for Leadership Team Evaluation, it talks both about components of a superintendent's evaluation, as well as, starting on page 9, is the board self-evaluation document. And so I suspect that this may be what you're considering adopting as the tool that you'll use. We have found that this was developed over the course of many years and looking at models from other states. Boards that have used this have found that it helps raise issues that they then, when they gather to actually conduct their self-evaluation, helps them have that conversation. CABE can support you doing this. It can be done electronically. Someone in our office compiles the results, and then someone from our staff, myself or Nick Caruso, could come out and facilitate that discussion based on your responses to the self-evaluation. The responses would be anonymous. We don't know which member of the board replied that they don't think the board has a mission, gave it a low rating. What the tool does is it helps someone who's going to facilitate that discussion see what are the areas where there's a lot of agreement among the board members about, gee, we're doing this really well. What are the areas where there's a lot of agreement, gee, this is something we need to work on as a board? And perhaps most importantly, are there areas where some board members think we're doing this great and other board members think, gee, this is a real problem. We need a lot more work in this area. So that's what the results, by getting them electronically and tabulating them, we're able to see where those disparities are and where the areas of agreement are.
Questions? So I will say we have used a variety of tools in the past, and we've had just conversations in the past. So I think in our last really robust conversation on this, the board was looking for more of kind of an objective tool, just like is developed here. And I think it would be wise of us, although it's not part of policy, but it would be wise for the board to really consider formally adopting this, so we know as we go along year to year, kind of how are we evaluating? I mean, sometimes our conversations have been very free-flowing. We have been through multiple superintendents. Sometimes that's dictated a free-flowing. But I think Dr. Adley and his dedication to Darien is not going anywhere. And I think it would be wise for the board to consider actually adopting the tool, because I think it helps us go throughout the year evaluating ourselves, so that when we get to this final evaluation, we have some benchmarks, or we've just put in some positions where we could evaluate. So I would entertain any thoughts on that.
So the process would be, we would adopt this, but then CABE would help facilitate the process as she described.
Well, I think we could kind of go through some of this today, our first time out. I think what you're talking about, Patrice, is if there's areas of concern, Nick could come down or someone from KMABE and help the board work through those areas of concern in a constructive way.
Yeah, well, yes, absolutely. If you do this, I mean, we can try to do this here today, or if you are more, what we generally do is have you then, if you've decided this is the tool, you use this tool, like we send it to you electronically, those results come back to us, and that way we're able to see before we come in, okay, what are the areas where there is definitely agreement, because there's a lot of specific items.
I like that, and
well, it's anonymous too, so people can just be truly honest, and they have the results, and they come back to us with the results and a plan based on the results, right? Is that
items for discussion. In other words, it's also important to remember that evaluation is not just a time to figure out, well, what do we really need to work on that we're not doing well? It's also a time to celebrate successes. Now more than ever, we get so engrossed in the things that are challenges for us that we forget about, wow, we're really effective at these things. And we all agree we're effective. And so let's take at least 30 seconds and celebrate that.
I mean, I think it would be an interesting way, in a way in which we haven't collaborated with CABE, who's got a breadth of knowledge, to approach it that way, but I'd be interested in hearing board members' thoughts.
I would agree. I agree.
Mrs. McCammon?
I agree. I think a facilitated interaction would be really helpful. Just to clarify on something you said, but from a policy perspective, we are actually required to do an evaluation every year, technically by April.
We are.
And we're required to have a tool as well. It actually says in here we must have an instrument.
It
says developed by the board, which I assume we could just adopt. But
okay, I'm just going to get a sentence out. I do think that it talks about an evaluation form. We've got the old, the new, the this. I agree with you that I'd like to adopt. I also think maybe policy needs to look at by April. We're usually so busy in April. We probably need to change that. I've never seen it done by April in my entire time on the board.
I don't think we've done it, but
I'm sorry?
I don't think we've been doing self-evaluations, but
I think we've done it in a variety of methods, and that's why adopting a formal tool and maybe a process with CABE sets out board member expectations. We could choose to maybe amend that timeline. The summer seems to be when we have these conversations, but then all 9 board members kind of know what the expectations are and the timeline is. I think that would be
it would be good to have it in tandem with the retreat. I just think.
Yeah.
And it's written, it's memorialized, right?
Yeah.
That hasn't been done in the past, correct?
I don't know, and I don't know that, so Patrice, you can talk about that. I don't know, is there a formal then written evaluation that comes back to the board, or is it more of a facilitated meeting?
We do it both ways. We do prepare, we have the capacity to take these results and turn them into a spreadsheet that shows you, where there's agreement, where there's disagreement. And sometimes boards ask us to actually share that document with every member of the board. Other times they ask us to just use it as a tool for our staff person as a facilitator.
So we have no requirement for written. We do have that there's a tool, although it says the evaluation shall be a composite of board members' opinions, but the board shall meet as a whole to discuss. The board shall not limit itself to the items on the evaluation forms, and judgment should be supported by evidence.
The first paragraph says written. I think we should review it because I think there's a lot of things in there we might not want to keep, to your point, but
my only suggestion is let's have policy look at it. If we have to make changes, let's do it.
Yeah.
I like the idea of memorializing like some other boards do. This is something that, as you said, over the years has happened in various different ways. I think it's going to be an important tool because going through our evaluation of our superintendent was a phenomenal experience for them. Yeah. So I'm hoping we can have the same thing, and I'm hoping Dr. Adley thought it was a phenomenal experience too. But no, seriously, I think hopefully it's we refine what we need to in policy, and then follow through now on a more formal.
So then what I'd like to do for this year, because I'd like to build off that idea, John, is I would suggest and can make a motion that we adopt this tool, we go through this process, we send it into CABE, and then also send to the policy committee a comprehensive review of this policy and come back with any suggestions you might have that the board could consider. But in the meantime, what I'd like to do is make a motion, if I can get a second, to adopt this policy and use CABE as a facilitator. So Mrs. Stein seconds that motion. Any discussion on that issue? I think we've had a lot of it. Okay, so all in favor of that, and that is unanimous, which probably goes back to Mr. Deneen's extra meetings later that we'll continue to have. So Patrice, we will look very much forward to, if you can, we can maybe get this process organized and get it out to the board for all their feedback. And then come up with a meeting time to kind of run down that.
What is a realistic timeline, you think, given that this is our first time trying to adopt this?
I mean,
we have a meeting on the 28th, don't we?
It won't take you more than an hour for you to complete this form, I would say. So then it's a matter of where it falls in your other duties.
I'm sorry, I meant you as a facilitator.
Oh, me?
Dave as a facilitator.
We can.
Okay.
We're pretty flexible.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So wait, when are we filling the form out?
We'll get an electronic copy.
And then we'll send it right to
and it will go back to CABE.
To the CABE office.
CABE will compile and come back with results for us. And we will work through it that way. And I think let's model it out this summer. That will actually help inform policy, I think, going forward. How did this model go? Policy can take a look at it, come back to us with any kind of suggestions as a full board, and we can look maybe to revise this, which hasn't been revised since 2008.
But then that facilitated follow-up discussion that can be remote or Zoom or something. It doesn't have to be this format.
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
We can do that in Zoom or electronically? We don't have to drag you guys down here? Is that correct?
It's up to you.
Okay.
If you're meeting in person.
I think it depends how we.
We are very willing to come. We are not that big of a state. So,
Look, I generally think these things work best, especially evaluations in person, right?
I do too.
I think it's that wall is difficult.
Yeah.
So my vote will be in person.
The travel is not a barrier. I appreciate your respect for that, but we are happy to come. That's what we do.
Is there anything that you would recommend to boards as we all fill out this form? Are there any? How do you recommend board members to approach it?
Again, you're going to be thinking about how you, as an individual board member, reflect on each of these. So, and I would just say, be honest with, and there may be things that, there is a column here that says not sure. So there may be things that, if you're fairly new to the board, you may not have an opinion on. And that's fine.
Unlikely.
Sorry, she looked at me.
Only because I know you're.
So, and part of this, because when I was reviewing this and thinking about it, we're in the middle of a strategic plan and coming up with a new vision and a new mission statement. So for me, that was kind of some of those in that category were interesting because we're right in that moment of change. So that's something we can also express, right? I feel like we're in that watershed.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And I'm pretty sure, and there's there are places for additional comments at the end of this, so it's not all check the box with a numeric rating. So if that's so you can explain your perspective on things like that. Like we are engaged in that process right now.
Yeah,
that's helpful too.
I think that's.
But before you leave, in terms of, I'm sorry.
No, I was just agreeing with you. I think that's an important point on that category that we're doing it, and so it's hard to evaluate there.
I think boards always kind of need to be looking, right, how to change, how to adapt, how to be responsive. I think there's also sometimes, as a board, kind of history of why you are where. How do you recommend that, the 9 of us get on the same page of something? It would be great if we just changed this, right? And there's some board members who are like, you can't change because you don't understand here, or I'm looking there. And I think a good exchange of ideas both helps people who are kind of stuck in traditional ways, and also sometimes saying to people, change comes so far so fast, you gotta move in steps. Any examples of how you've helped boards facilitate I mean, I came on the board like, we should do this, and we should do this, and we should do this, and then I learned like it's a little bit more like an ocean liner you're trying to turn.
Right. I think
or adjust.
Understanding that, looking to your superintendent for guidance as to, all right, this change is not difficult to accomplish, not costly. If the board agrees, we can just go ahead and do it. Versus, all right, these are some heavy lifts, some big ticket items. Then as a board, you're going to have to prioritize and say, all right, which of these levers of change, and get recommendations from your administration, what's going to make a real difference for our students as opposed to change for the sake of change. I think if you use that as your guiding principle, what's going to have the biggest positive impact on students, then it's a little easier to navigate through the 85 great ideas that the collective body might have.
Okay. Mrs. McCann.
Are you talking about organizational change within the board versus change that would necessarily directly impact students?
No, I'm really talking about all of it. I think all of us, when we came on this board, right, like come on with a set of like, what interested us in becoming on a board of education. I think all of us, the longer you sit here, you realize the intricacies of it. We have an election in November, right? Like there's a lot of gung-ho ideas. There might be a lot of like, I think that's always that new moment of change. Every time you have new people, how do you help mentor them along and also take new ideas, right? Because you can't always be the only one with ideas. So it's just that mix and match. I think sometimes, everyone has new ideas. How do you weigh them? How do you bring people along in them? That's what I was getting at.
So basically I'm hearing that we use the superintendent as a sounding block. Basically, if there are ideas that are being generated, he can be our point person as we flush out those ideas and whether they become board priorities or not.
Right, because you're going to need some background information on, what may appear on the surface to be, just really simple to do, may have other ramifications that the administration would know about that you as a board member would have no reason to know.
The other thing I'm sorry, Ms. McCown and Mr. Cini.
I think to that point, Deb, it depends, and there I think we struggle sometimes. Like if you're talking about how the board is operating, you as a board make that decision. If you're talking about change that would impact the schools and the district and the goals and objectives of the district, you lean on your superintendent. I think that's different.
Yeah.
I was up a level. What I was saying is there's always good ideas for change. That doesn't mean the change happens immediately, but how do you not discount good new ideas and bring them into the fold, but also help people with lots of new ideas to say, we got a part and parcel, or you need to understand why this happens. Because sometimes you've got a great idea, but if you don't know the who's and the whys, what you don't understand is the mistake in the good idea. And I'm not putting down anyone's ideas, my own included. I really was looking at when I came on the board, I was like, I'm going to get this done and this done and this done and this done, and I've gotten some of that done. I was more a reflection on my own ideas. Mr. Cini and then Mr. Barker.
I was just going to say again, it goes back to the board's will. And if somebody has an idea, they should be given the opportunity to present it. If it might be as crazy as it sounds, allow a quick public discussion over it. Everybody can say, you're off in left field here. And then it's done. That idea is finished. Or that person convinces others that, hey, this might be a good operational change, but the opportunity is given, the voice is heard, and the board's will determines what's proper and what's not.
Do you have thoughts, Patrice, on that?
Yeah, I think I would agree that floating the idea, you just have to, again, balance. You don't want your whole board agenda to be random new ideas. That's the other balance. I think that would be my only observation.
Mr. Barker.
Well, no, I was thinking as we consider things that are operational or versus other different types of policies, we've all been members of one board. Dr. Adley has worked for several boards. His administration has been on several boards. They may be very well informed on various different types of board processes. So as we think of board processes, I would invite them to weigh in and comment as well, because they have a breadth of experience, even though it's not directly related to their job, it's our process, but they may be very well informed and have great experience with how other boards work.
Sure. Since we have a few minutes left, I have one other question that I think comes up repeatedly for the board. This idea of transparency, right? And I think you hit on it with the budget, with like, we get in a budget appropriation, but we can make changes in that. I do think everyone up here really makes a concerted effort when they put a budget forward. They're being transparent in the moment of time for the budget they have going forward. I think sometimes what we struggle to communicate effectively is that when that changes, that's not a bait and switch by us at any point. Kids change, and so we are reactive. Do you hear some of those concerns in other boards in the state, and or do you have any advice on either how to communicate that better or more effectively? Because I think I struggle in some ways. I think we're a very transparent board. I think we meet in public. I think we put out a budget. It's itemized line by line. We have with Dr. Adley and Rich, we've even improved, I think, kind of our budget review process or our finance committee review process. But do you hear some of those concerns around the state? And if you do, how do people mitigate them?
You do hear some of them. In some communities, municipal officials have a notion of, well, if that's in the budget, then they're definitely going to make sure there are one-to-one devices for all the students. And then the board finds out about certain special education costs or certain costs related to reopening around COVID, and says, well, we've got to reprioritize within, because we are responsible and we are fiscally responsible, and we know we can't overexpend the bottom line. So that's why we have to make these adjustments, which the budget is not the budget you present is not a guarantee that everything will be as presented, because you can't guarantee that your costs won't vary. And I think as long as you're being transparent about, all right, we have a report from finance that there are increases in the cafeteria costs because of the new procedures around delivering lunch in this new environment. Okay, so we've got to make an adjustment somewhere else, or otherwise our budget will be out of balance. And so that may mean a reduction in some area that the board supported and put it in the budget, but you now realize you're not going to be able to fund it. So the budget is essentially a living document. It's not this is what we said when did you start your budget process? December?
I'm not sure it ever really ends, but
okay, well that's sort of the point. It doesn't ever really end.
No. Yeah.
So whatever you thought last December or March is going to have to be adjusted.
Mrs. Ritchie.
So just adding on that, I guess we have a finance committee that meets every month, and we review all that information. We have a public meeting, it's televised, people can watch it. But I still think people are still having trouble understanding that process. So is there something else that we can do? Is there something you would recommend that we go beyond that to help better perception or understanding?
When you're televising committee meetings, I mean, part of the challenge is, at least before people were spending so much time at home, they didn't necessarily tune in to watch a committee meeting. So the information was there, but not necessarily...
They're recorded too, so people can do it at their leisure,
right,
at 10 o'clock at
night. Then I would
time.
say that the people that are interested in actually getting the information have the opportunity to do that. You can only provide it to them. You can't make them read it or watch it or
lead a horse to water.
Necessarily agree with it.
Mrs. McCowan.
I think this board has done two really big things with transparency this year that we should celebrate. I think that we've done a lot of work went into the transfer process and making sure that process was very clearly reflected how our policy was written, and there's a lot of work has been done in clarifying what transfers look like, what we need to vote on, what they actually mean. So I think we should celebrate that. And the second thing I think we did was make those pre-buys in a public, so it was been public, but a deliberative manner. And so we had a very open, not honest is the wrong word, we had a very open, deliberative conversation about what to do with pre-buys. And I think, there's we've done a lot of work in this area. I think that question of transparency is a difficult one because different people mean different things by what transparency is. And there are some who have, different perspectives on how to do that with finance. But I think this board has been working on it, and we should celebrate some of our successes.
So I agree, and I think it's kind of like we're always working towards it. I'd say pre-buying we have always done publicly, but this year, because of the budget cuts we faced, we're having a real budget conversation about how to move forward, right? So that highlighted it even more. Right. And I don't think that, good God, I think we all hope that it's not that highlighted every single year, not pre-buying in general, but the budget isn't being decided in June every year, right? So, yeah, I think none of us want that. So I just, and look, I do know the public is watching, and what I do believe is that the people on this board have always tried to be transparent, right? I do believe that with our finances. I actually think kind of what Deb and Patrice are talking about, and maybe what John said is the perfect phrase on this, like you can lead the horse to water, but I can't make you drink. But I think I would reaffirm what I have seen in all my years in the Board of Education. Some of you have been on longer than me, is there's only the desire to be transparent. We are sitting up here in public meetings doing it. It is not our money. It is taxpayer money. We're doing it on the benefit for kids. And where we disagree, we will disagree and have it out in public. But transparency has always been the goal of this board. And that's why I was looking. If there's ways to enhance it, let us know, because I think that's the collective good here.
Sounds like we're doing it.
Yeah. Sounds like you're doing what you need to do.
Yeah, it sounds
so it's my understanding then, with this new reevaluation that we're going to undergo, like we can address, not that transparency is a current concern, but some of the other issues that came up earlier. We're going to have a dedicated agenda item now to kind of discuss, like operations, transparency, any of these items that we kind of just touched upon this today, right?
So as we're designing, as we go, what's in my head, although I'm happy to talk to you all about it, is that I think that we wouldn't do this during a regular meeting. I think we'd set a separate meeting. It's a long enough discussion that it's not agenda item, and it'll be interesting to see what we cull back, because that will help, with CABE's help, facilitate where we go on that meeting.
Awesome.
If I may, I would also say today would be something I would add to that list. Today would also be something I would add to your list of accomplishments of going through this particular process. It's always interesting when you come back, though, to see areas of identification for a board, or for anybody doing an evaluation, and go, how do I get from here to here, and what are the collective commitments we want to make to do that? But anyway.
So any other questions for Patrice? For once, we're almost on schedule. It's never happens.
Patrice, thank you so much.
Thank you again.
Good luck.
And thank you for the trip down.
Absolutely.
Yes.
So, unless you decide you want someone else.
No, you're good.
Nah, we're happy.
Leave our address.
Be well, everyone.
All right, thank you. All right, so we will now take our lunch break.
No, we got to do the.
We have action items.
We
Sorry.
weren't quite.
Yeah, we have.
You tell I didn't eat breakfast this morning.
Oh no. I'm very hungry.
All right.
We have to do the food service
so,
contract.
Right.
We will. We have business matters. Can I entertain action on to approve the proposed food service contract? I'm definitely giving this one to Mr. Brown. Mr. Brown so moves. Mr. Burke seconds. All in favor? That is unanimous. Also, the board met as in executive session and did the superintendent's review. So may I have a motion to renew the superintendent's contract? Mr. Burke so moves. Mr. Maroney seconds. All in favor? That is also unanimous. Thank you all for that. And now we're going to take a break for lunch. All right.
We just take a break.
Yeah, we're just going to take a break.
We're just going to recess,
so it's fine. We don't need